Hi everyone, welcome to another Git Kraken workshop. This one will cover how to ensure your Jira Git integrations are reliable and easy to maintain. This session was hosted by two members of the Git Integration for Jira support team, David and Roberto. They both have tons of experience working with customers in different environments, ensuring their integrations are set up properly and working well. So they have lots of best practices and tips and tricks to share in this session. Without further ado, let's hop into it. Thank you everyone for joining today's Git Kraken workshop, where we're going to focus on some tips for optimizing your integrations with Git in Jira. I will be kind of leading today's session, hosting, but my two friends here will be doing most of the presenting. My name's Ken Petzold. I'm part of the Git Kraken product team, focused on our Team Insights for Jira app extension, but I work closely with the rest of the Git Kraken product team as well. I'm joined by Roberto and David, who are both part of our customer success and customer support teams. They spend a lot of time working with customers, helping them troubleshoot, but also helping to get their systems configured in the way that works best for them in their environment. So they have a lot of experience with different kind of setups, working through different kind of situations that customers go through. So today we're going to kind of lean on them to share some of those experiences on the best way to set up your integrations and keep them maintained going forward. Before we get started, a couple things just to cover is we're going to cover workflows both for Jira Data Center and Jira Cloud. So some things will apply to both. Some things might have minor nuances on one deployment versus the other. So the team here will call that out and you'll be able to see that on the screen. If you do have any questions that pop up, something you want to be clarified or something that is not clear, please feel free to use the Q&A widget that's there and ask those questions. We'll review those and get to them at the end, or try to answer them at that point if it's appropriate. This session will be recorded, so anything you want to go back to and refer to, this will be available to you after the session. And one thing to note as well is when we're sharing, you might see two screens at one time. Half of that screen is going to be some notes that's kind of going to help reinforce what the team's talking about. But for the most part, just focus on what they're saying and what they're showing as far as what they're demoing on the other side of the screen. And finally, before I hand it off, a quick agenda, which we'll be covering today, is again, really best practices for how you set up and maintain the integration connections that you're making in Git Integration for Jira. A lot of that is important when you're planning this ahead of time. So even if you do have connections today, you might pick up some tips on maybe different ways to configure it, but there's a lot that goes into it besides just using what's in the interface, and the team will cover that. We'll also touch on a couple of other topics on how to structure your integrations, things to think about as far as relating to permissions, and then potential ways to troubleshoot any issues that you come upon as you're using the app. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll round it out with some Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Robert, and he'll get us started.
Today, we're going to cover mostly the importance of the pre-planning stage of getting everything set up. So this will mostly be geared towards newer clients who are looking to get started and set up their all their integrations. Generally, people that have already their configuration set up, some of this might be helpful if you're thinking of restructuring or if you're having issues and looking for a better way to kind of set everything up. It's a little bit more difficult to do that later on, which is why we're trying to stress the importance of planning this stuff out ahead of time. We're going to go over a bunch of different things, but to get started, we always suggest that when you first start using the application, before you actually go in and do any configuration, take the time to actually plan some stuff out based on how the application works and to kind of get everything set up for success to avoid some common pitfalls. That mostly being like long indexing times, possibly hitting rate limiting with the different Git services, things of that nature. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have a meeting with your Git services team, so your GitHub or GitLab, your Azure team, as well as your DevOps teams, to find out what their needs are and to get a little bit more information in case you are not an admin on those services as well. You're going to want to gather a bunch of information because that'll help you structure how you're going to do everything. So the main thing that you're going to want to get is you're going to want to know the number of total repositories that they're expecting to bring into the integrations through Jira. That will help you. That's kind of your starting point. The total number of repositories is very important. And then once you kind of get the total number, you're going to want some basic information about how the Git service is structured. So you're going to want to know the number of organizations or groups in GitLab or GitHub that those repositories are spread out across, what kind of naming conventions they use. In some cases, you might have one specific org, but then, your actual projects might be named, project A/repo1, project A/repo2. All of that kind of things will be important because that will help you in how you create your integrations. And then you're also going to want to know what their workflow is for generally whenever they create new orgs or groups or repositories, meaning, do they generally create them separately? Do they add a new org? How often that happens? This will help you plan ahead to have the application automatically pick that new information up. Depending on how everything is structured, it may or may not come in automatically. And then just a few things to be aware of. You're going to want to know if generally they use a lot of larger files in their repositories, because our application does have a 2 GB per file size limit. That's a limitation of one of our internal components that we use. And that's going to cause some issues for you if that is included. So if, when you're having your meeting with your Git services team, let them know that that's something that they should be aware of. And if they do have larger files that are over 2 GB, they can do some stuff like implement Git LFS in order to offload that from that repo. That will prevent you from having to go in and exclude that repository or just not include it at all, because that is something that could potentially happen if there are some of those larger files in there. And then once you have that information, you're going to want to kind of ascertain what type of information they're wanting to see in Jira and what is important to them. That will help you decide which features you're going to want to use and what type of structure you can take. So you're going to want to know, obviously, most people are going to want to see commits, branches, and pull and merge requests. So that's just kind of the basic functionality of our application. So everybody's really going to want to see that. So that's kind of a given, but you do want to kind of double check to make sure that that's specifically what they want to see. Code compare and code diff is something that is going to be by default. Some clients may or may not have some restrictions around security regarding whether or not they want to see that in Jira or have that available to Jira. So in which case that will vary. In data center, you do have the option to turn that off. In cloud, you don't have the option to turn that off directly, but you can take a different integration approach, which we'll discuss later on. So there is a little bit of workaround there. And then you're going to want to know if they're interested in creating branches and pull or merge requests directly from Jira. That is, again, something that you can turn on and off directly in the application in case it's not needed. Additionally, if they're interested in setting up any kind of automation, so we do pass automation triggers to the built-in Atlassian automation system, so we can actually go in and perform some basic functionality like, transitioning issues is generally what most people set them up for. That's definitely something that's very useful. So if that's something that they're interested, that might be something that you want to get ahead of time. That way you can just go ahead and set those up once you're doing the configuration. A few important things that you're going to want to know specifically in data center is if they want to see Git tag information in their Jira issues. We'll discuss why that is later, but you're going to want to know if that's something that they're interested in. And then as far as GIJ Cloud, you're going to want to know if they require historical data. In data center, there is no option available to not bring in historical data, so that's a moot point. But for cloud, there are some kind of workarounds there, so that's definitely something that you're going to want to find out. And then additionally, just a few other things that you want to consider. You're going to want to know if your company has security restrictions that are going to have that are going to prevent you from creating, like, say, multiple service accounts in your Git service. If there's security protocols around cloning repositories, or moving code. If if you're using data center, if there's any kind of firewall or proxies around your Jira instance, that's all going to be kind of important as far as how you can create your integrations. So data center doesn't have any integration types that don't require repository cloning. So that is something important to note. If your particular organization does not allow repository cloning, unfortunately, if you're using data center, that's not something that we offer currently with that. If you're using Jira Cloud, we do offer webhook indexing, which doesn't require repo cloning, but it is important to know that that's feature limited. So the main thing is, in most cases, you're not going to be able to do branch or pull or merge request creation. You're not going to get any historical Git data, and you're not going to be able to get any code compare, code diff, or code change information included in the update. So that one is a very bare bones solution. Basically, all you're going to get is metadata, commit, and branch and pull request information, but you're not going to get a lot of specifics. And the other thing that you're going to want to consider is whether or not you need to manage code or Git data visibility between different Jira projects or user groups. That is something that you can do through the application in a few different ways. We'll discuss that later on, but that's definitely something that you're going to want to know up front. That way you can apply those permissions ahead of time. And then in data center, the additional thing that you're going to want to consider is storage. Because we require cloning your repositories, storage is going to be important. So, please make sure that you have the same amount of storage that your repositories take up, plus about 10% for our data on top of it. That's unfortunately just kind of a byproduct of us having to clone your repository to provide direct code compare and code diff and code change information. So that is definitely something to be aware of there. And then, so some of the main issues that you're going to run across, and we'll kind of discuss some of the workarounds now, is going to be rate limiting. So, as a lot of you guys are aware, most Git services, they have a limit to the amount of API calls that you can make. For most services, it's limited per user per hour. In most cases, if you don't have like a huge amount of repositories, or if those repositories are very simple and they don't have a lot of different things in them, like branches or pull requests, that might not be so much of a consideration. But if you have a very large instance where you have a lot of total repositories, if some of those repositories have very long Git histories, with like a ton of branches and a ton of pull request information, that is something that you definitely might hit. So it's important to kind of know a few things up front. Our application doesn't have any hard limits on things, so you can create, as many realistically as many integrations as you need, as well as include any number of repositories that you want in there. However, there are kind of known performance limitations that they're not hard limits, but we've observed some issues going past that. So generally, you're not going to want to surpass more than 2,000 repositories per integration. And that's, again, more so just a limitation of the performance hit that's associated with that. At that point, you're going to see very long indexing times. You're going to see possible rate limiting issues. You're going to see some page performance. Things are going to start taking a little bit longer to load. You can work around a lot of that stuff. So the main thing that we suggest is to create a larger number of integrations with containing less repositories. So, if you have 10,000 repositories, instead of creating one integration that has all 10,000, you're going to want to break that up. Preferably, if you can, break them up to include less than 2,000 repos. Again, it's not a hard limit. If you go over, 1 or 200, it's not a huge deal, especially if you've got a very robust data center instance with a lot of horsepower. That will definitely help. But yeah, you're generally not going to want to, you're going to want to try very hard to stay under that 2K limit, just because it's going to cause you guys a lot of different problems. So this is where the pre-planning stage comes into play. Hopefully your Git structure is kind of broken up in a way where you're able to easily limit stuff down. Generally, the best way to do that is just using custom API path filtering. That way you can break them down and create an integration based on organizations or specific groups, depending if you're using GitLab or GitHub or Azure. That might, which one you use might be different. But that's kind of the generally suggested way to do it, is to just break them up by orgs or groups. And then that will hopefully keep you down underneath there. If not, you can still use JMIS path filtering to limit the scope of the integration. That gets a little bit more complicated based on what your Git structure is and what naming conventions you guys use. In that case, you'll kind of have to look at our documentation. Generally, at that point, we're going to have to suggest usually that you do it by the beginning parts of some of the group names. Hopefully, you'll be able to do it that way. If not, there's a few different ways you can do it. So just reach out to us and we'll try and walk you through what might work best for you guys. And the other thing you're going to want to do is, if you have a lot of different organizations or a large number of repositories, you're definitely going to want to spread that out across multiple service accounts. That's again to avoid rate limiting. If you try and connect everything with one account, all the API calls are going to get tallied to that same account, and you're pretty quickly going to run through that rate limit. So say, for instance, for GitLab or GitHub.com, that's 5,000 per user per hour. There's a little bit of leeway there under certain circumstances. If you're using GitHub Enterprise, that is a configurable number, so you can possibly raise that up a little bit. But that will very much vary depending on your specific circumstance. And for data center, you're also going to want to take some performance into consideration. So you're going to want to tune your indexing timer, and you're going to want to disable some features that aren't going to be used before you create your integrations. So, for instance, if you're not going to use Git tags or you don't need to use JQL searching, we generally suggest that you turn those features off first, just because that is going to help get through the initial indexing phase quicker. That is definitely something to note. Generally, whenever you're going through your configuration, the first time you set up your integrations, the first time indexing is going to take a lot longer than all the subsequent ones. That's because we're performing a lot more actions. We have to clone your entire repo first, and then we have to parse through the entire Git history to look for historical Git data. Once we're past that phase, then everything becomes a lot faster, but the first few times it's definitely a lot more API calls and a lot more manual kind of work for the application. And then on the cloud side of things, networking is definitely going to be an issue for some of you guys if your Git services are self-hosted. So in that case, you're going to want to have to weigh the options between possibly whitelisting our IPs or having to use a webhook indexing integration. That will vary again depending on your specific needs, but that is definitely something that you're going to want to take a look at. And again, just to kind of quickly go over that, the main thing that you're going to want to do when you're planning your integrations is you're going to want to create as many number of integrations as you need to try and stay under 2,000 repositories per integration. If possible, your best bet is to create one integration per org or group or project. If you're over 2,000 for any given group or project, then at that point you can try splitting them up further using custom API path or JMIS path filtering. Again, that will vary depending on the specifics of how your Git structure is broken up. And then if Git visibility is a concern, you're definitely going to want to try and group as much stuff together as will need to be grouped together permissions wise. So say, for instance, if you have one repository that only one group that only works on a handful of repositories and they only work out of one Jira project, and you need to see their visibility limited to only them and that project. The easiest way to manage that is just to create one integration for that group. That way you can just apply very quick project permissions to it, and then at that point everything is kind of limited down. And then just a few additional things to configure. These we won't go into too much detail. Just definitely something that that you're going to want to take a look at in our documentation. The main one being whether or not you want to have a Jira admin do the configuration, or if you want to utilize GIJ managers. We've recently rolled out a feature where you're able to give people in Jira that are not Jira admins manager permissions in our application specifically, so that they can go in and change some settings. They can create their own integrations. This is very helpful if you have a very large organization. That way, not all of the task of creating a bunch of integrations falls directly on the Jira admin. At that point, you can delegate that out to some of your GIJ managers. Generally, we suggest you use your either your group or your project owners in Git services for that. And then the main thing is going to be to look at, again, usage or visibility of the repo browser, multi-node indexing. There's a few different things that you can do with that. If you've got a lot of different nodes, you don't have to utilize all of them for indexing. So at that point, what you can do is you can limit indexing down to one specific node and then load balance out your users to some of the other nodes. That way, in case there is ever an issue or there's a lot of information being processed on that one specific node, it won't be as visible to your users. That's definitely helpful in case performance might be an issue for you. And then the main thing is going to be setting user expectations around usage. So just taking the time to, explain to everybody that's going to be using it how the application works. So your indexing time, how long things are going to take to appear in Jira, and then what the linking behavior is like. So in our application on both sides, the way it works is we look for Jira issue keys in all of your Git data. So if you are using commits, branches, or pull requests, in the commits, it needs to be in the initial commit message or description. In branches, it needs to be in the branch name. And in pull requests, it needs to be in the pull request title. In any of those circumstances, it doesn't matter like if it's in the beginning or the end or anything like that. As long as it's in those places, then we'll pick that up. Oftentimes, whenever we get requests about some things perhaps not showing up in Jira, sometimes it's just because the issue key wasn't included in the correct place. So that's definitely something to make your developers aware of, just to set their proper expectations of what will appear in Jira and what won't. And again, if you're doing a POC, so if you're doing a trial and you're not creating your entire integration first on your production environment, you're definitely going to want to take scaling into consideration when you're doing your POC versus when you go to prod. Once you go to production, it might not be behaving quite the same, just because once you increase a lot of the amount of information that you're bringing in, so you might only be doing a few repositories at a time first whenever you're doing your trial run. Once you bring in everything, then at that point, there's a few additional things you're going to need to do. You're going to want to tune your indexing timer. You're going to want to set up webhooks. All that stuff we'll kind of cover here next. So generally, there's a few different workflows that we've started suggesting to customers to kind of ease the transition. It's important to note, because you're dealing with a lot of data, if you have a lot of repositories, the initial setup isn't quite as like click it and forget it as it would seem just based on the UI elements. So it's important to kind of know that ahead of time. It might take you a little bit to get everything fully up and running. Once everything is, then generally you don't have to do it a lot. You don't have to mess with it a lot. So that's why it's important to kind of get things up front. So just a quick run through of how the best way to do it is, if you're a Jira admin, the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to change the installation default 5-minute reindexing interval to something closer to 3 or 4 hours. By default, the application sets it at 5 minutes when it's first installed. If you're bringing in a ton of stuff, that's not going to be enough. And at that point, you're going to want to increase it just to avoid flooding your indexing queue. And then you're going to want to disable your global webhook endpoint. So here, this is kind of where I'll start showing you guys some stuff on our actual configuration here. So this is my Jira data center. The webhook endpoint, this is the global webhook. endpoint. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to note down your webhook URL and your secret key. And I'll tell you guys how we're going to use that in a minute. So note that down and then disable it. And then in Jira Cloud, so this is my Jira Cloud instance, it's the same thing. In Jira Cloud, they're called indexing triggers. So you click here and it's the same thing. You're just going to want to get your secret key and your webhook URL and then disable that. And then if you're using Jira Cloud, or I'm sorry, if you're using Data Center, you're going to want to go to your general settings page and disable some features that you're not going to use. So for instance, calculating Git tags and JQL searching. Both of those are fairly intensive operations. So if you're not going to use them, we definitely suggest disabling them just to avoid some performance hits. And then once you do that, all you got to do is you're going to want to create one integration at a time. Generally, we suggest that you wait until the initial cloning or indexing completes before you continue on with your next one. While this is happening, this is a good time to go in and edit the integration and set a friendly display name for it. That way you know what specific group or org that's for and what repos might be included. And then at that point, while you're waiting for that to complete, this is a good time to set up your webhooks on your Git service side as well. They won't do anything until you turn that back on, but you can set them up ahead of time just to save some time. And then once everything finishes indexing, you just go ahead and go on and do the next integration that you're planning, and then you just rinse and repeat until you're done. Once everything is completed, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to tune your indexing timer. So what you're going to want to do is in Data Center, you're going to go to your indexing queue. This will kind of give you some visibility into what the application is doing and when as far as indexing goes. The main thing you're going to want to look for here is under the schedule time for indexing in minutes. You see a last run duration here. That's telling you how long the indexing is taking to run on your instance. After the initial indexing phase, generally wait a few hours, maybe a day, to let everything stabilize out, and then come in and look at your last run duration. And then what you're going to want to do is in your general settings, you're going to want to go ahead and come down all the way to the bottom under repository reindexing here. This is your scanning interval. You're going to want to set that to that same value in minutes. And then usually we suggest, adding maybe 5 or 10 minutes on top of that. That's just to allow for some additional operations, or, if there's a new repository added, anything like that, you have a little bit of leeway there. And then you're just going to want to save, and then you're good to go there. And once you're done with that, then you're just going to come in, and then at that point you can re-enable the webhook. The reason you disable the webhook is so that you don't start getting updates from your repositories while the initial indexing phase is occurring. And then that's just going to add things to your indexing queue, which is going to, extend your indexing time a little bit. So you're definitely going to want to enable that until the very end, and then you're good to go. If you have a lot of different integrations that you're going to need to create, we definitely suggest using GIJ managers. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to go in and add permissions to the people that you're going to choose to create their own integrations. Generally, what we suggest is you can just create a quick document to show them how to create the integration. So you can create one and then just take some screenshots, provide it to them, and then you can give them permissions, and then do the same thing, disable the webhooks, and then disable your unused features. Then you can give the documentation to your GIJ managers on how to create it. Generally we suggest you might want to do that in stages as well. That way not everybody goes in and does it at once. And then the same thing, just provide them the webhook URL and the secret key along with that documentation, and just have them create the integration and the webhook at the same time. You can keep an eye on it on your end. Once that's done, then the next set can go in and do it. Then once everybody's done, then you just enable your webhook endpoint. And then after that, you're good to go. And for the cloud side of things, cloud is a little bit easier because there's not as much configuration to be done as far as settings goes. On the cloud side of things, mostly everything runs pretty much on our end, so there's not a lot of configuration, so you can't tune your indexing time, anything like that. So once you're there, you're just going to basically want to do the same thing, disable your global indexing trigger endpoint, just get that information first, and then you're going to do the exact same thing. Create your one integration at a time, wait until that's done, go and set a display name, create your webhook, and then once that's done, just move on to your next integration. And once all your integrations are done, then you can just go ahead and turn on your indexing trigger endpoint, and you're good to go. And basically, again, the same thing with if you want to utilize GIJ managers. It's basically the exact same workflow. You just create the permissions for your managers first. And then just a few additional suggestions really quickly here as far as some things that you should consider. If you're using Data Center, we always recommend that you use the enable required user pattern enforce get service permissions setting. What that's going to do is that's going to make sure that actions created in Jira, so branches and pull requests, that those get associated to the correct user on the Git side of things instead of the generic connecting account. And that's also going to allow you to limit visibility down to what that user actually has access to. We will query their permissions from your Git service, and then we will only let them see stuff from repositories that they have access to. And on the cloud side, we do offer the required user path setting. Unfortunately, there is no global level setting for that, so you'll actually have to come in and enable that per integration. So I suggest you just do that after you create it when you go in to set your display name. So when you go to edit your integration, after you first create it, you'll see here that you have your display name. So you just set a friendly name there. And then under feature settings, you'll see the option here for required users to specify their own personal access token. And then you can just go ahead and hit save. After that, you should be good to go. Hopefully that will get you, on a much better footing than if you just create one gigantic integration. A few other quick things to note. We suggest that you try out some of our free extension applications. That's just going to expand some capabilities of the software. So for Data Center, we do offer Team Insights for Jira. It allows you to see Git development activity across different projects, epics, sprints, all that kind of stuff. It definitely helps with project planning and some visibility into what's occurring in your repositories in the context of your actual Jira issue. So it definitely helps with planning. And on the cloud side, we also offer that same application, but we additionally also offer CI/CD for Jira. That allows you to bring in build and deployment data into Jira. So that'll definitely help you gain greater visibility, because then at that point, you can see if builds have actually deployed, if your builds are failing, anything like that. That kind of gives you some insight there. And other than that, you should be good to go. Just a quick note, we are planning to start offering planning consultations moving forward. You can definitely find the link for that in our marketplace listing. So if this is something that you're interested in, but it's a lot to kind of digest at once. So if you want to hop on a call with us, David or myself are happy to jump in. So we can definitely hop on a call with you, discuss your needs, and we'll suggest, the right approach for your specific needs. For now, I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to David. He's got a few additional things that he can talk about, just as far as some additional features and some things that you might want to set up.
Let's jump to a couple of Q&A questions that popped up. There was one that I think we answered in the chat, but I just want to make sure we touch on a little bit more. It was a question about, is it possible to have multiple integrations for Azure? There's two different teams that use Azure, but maintaining their Gits in separate areas. Robert, you want to hop in on that one?
Yeah, so you can definitely integrate different teams or organizations. Depending on the level of access that the account that you use to create the integration has, you'll be able to see it just from your repository list, and you'll just be able to choose which ones you want to include. If you're using Pat, you can just have them generate a new Pat from that organization, and then you can just use that as well. And to address the other one from earlier, in Jira Cloud, that you always have to press refresh to see the development details. Unfortunately, that is intentional. That's to work around a limitation with that specific panel, sometimes timing out if you have a lot of Git data involved. Sometimes, if you have a lot of Git data, that can slow page load performance. So currently it is intentional. That is being worked on. We are planning some improvements in the future to possibly eliminate that. It kind of depends on how our testing goes. But for now, yes, that is intentional.
If you do want, a more personal kind of look at your configuration, like Robert mentioned before, you can schedule that. There's a link either on the marketplace listing, or you can use the form on the help center. They'll hop on a call with you, kind of look at what you're trying to do, how you're set up, and offer some recommendations there. Another thing I wanted to point out is the product team is working on email alerts for connection issues. So if you do have an integration that for whatever reason runs into an issue indexing, you can opt in to get email alerts for that, and then also get like a daily digest if it's not corrected by the end of the day, to give you kind of a readout on that. So that'll help you be a bit more proactive if there is some sort of issue related to permissions or authentication that's expired. You'll be able to take real-time action on that. And then looks like we have one more question, and it also looks like, David, we have you on voice now.
Hopefully. Sorry about that. I just wanted to stress sometimes when especially for data center, when data is not it seems that the plugin is not working. Let's go to the next slide, actually. Thank you. Don't panic first. Sometimes, users may tell us nothing is working, but in the end, like, the plugin is working. But sometimes we need to adjust some things, as Robert mentioned. And the first thing is to actually check the logs, to review the logs, and they have useful information. And if you all don't understand anything, you can just send us an email, or we also have an in-chat an option. So you can ask us what the problem is, and we are going to help you there. Also, the indexing queue for data center is very interesting. You can see if there is a repository that is taking longer. Wait for some time will help sometimes. And one important thing for data center is do not reset the index. Sometimes that will cause to amplify the problem. And verify the re-index interval as well. That's something that Robert explained also. Sometimes the plugin has this option to re-index everything in 5 minutes, but you may have to increase that sometimes. And if nothing seems to work, in that case, for data center, you can disable and enable the app, and that will kind of reset the plugin. For cloud, things are a little different in that regard. You will see that integrations will be indexed constantly. But sometimes Jira has some rate limits for some specific data. And so in some cases, when you don't see some data in the development panel, you may want to disable the integration and enable it back. So that's all from me.
Thanks, David. We did have one last question about hiding the Bitbucket panel. I'm not sure if you guys understand the request, but that's something we can follow up separately and get back to you with an answer on.
Yeah, just really quickly, it depends on what you're referring to. So if you're referring directly to the Jira development panel, if you're using Jira Cloud, I believe you can change your project settings to not include that specific panel. If you're trying to limit visibility of that by using the View Development Tools permission, that will also hide our panel. But I believe in Jira Cloud, you are able to remove that panel from your view. And I believe that's available in the project settings.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate it. I know we went a bit over time, but thanks for hanging on. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next time.
All right. Thank you, guys. Sorry for going long. We appreciate your time.